It was March 28, 2024. Inside a high-security facility in Mississippi, an inmate who had spent nearly half a century behind bars was preparing for what would be the final chapter of his life. His name was Richard Gerald Jordan. His case had faded from national headlines decades ago, but in that moment the weight of time caught up with him, and with the system that had kept him waiting. He wasn't young when the sentence was carried out. He was 78. And by then, his name had come to symbolize something deeper, not just a crime, but a question about how long is too long to wait for justice or for punishment. Back in 1976, Jordan had been convicted for his role in a tragic incident that took the life of a Gulfport businessman. He was sentenced to death row, expected to be executed within years. But the years passed. Then decades. Through a maze of appeals, reversals, and reinstatements, Jordan became one of the longest-serving individuals on death row in American history. Over time, the public stopped paying attention. His name wasn't in the news. No protests, no headlines, no campaigns, just a man aging, waiting, largely forgotten, until 2024, when what changed in the legal system to delay his punishment for so long? And what toll did it take not just on Jordan but on the families involved? This is not just the story of one man's crime. It's a story about delay, about justice frozen in place, about what happens when the final chapter is written nearly 5 decades after the first page. Some say he got what the system promised. Others say keeping someone on death row for that long is a punishment in itself. Whatever you believe, one thing is clear. Richard Gerald Jordan's story is not just about what he did in 1976, it's about what didn't happen for the next 49 years. And it's a reminder that sometimes, the slowest decisions leave the deepest questions. Before his name became a permanent entry on Mississippi's death row roster, Richard Gerald Jordan was a quiet, unassuming figure in the background of American life. Born in 1945, he grew up in the Deep South during an era marked by economic hardship and social change. His early years, though not well documented in mainstream media, painted a picture of a man who lived on the edge of struggle, never quite finding firm ground. He wasn't the kind of person who drew much attention. Friends and acquaintances described him as reserved, someone who rarely shared his personal life and mostly kept to himself. There are no stories of wild youth, no records of serious criminal activity, no early signs that pointed to the future he would face. In fact, for much of his early adult life, Jordan worked various jobs, kept out of trouble, and lived in relative obscurity. But behind the quiet exterior, something had begun to shift. As the years passed, Jordan faced a series of personal setbacks, financial instability, failed relationships, and increasing isolation. Would suggest that he felt cornered by circumstances, pressured by money problems, and overwhelmed by the weight of failure. It's important to note that, even as his life began to fracture, there were no warning signs loud enough to draw the attention of authorities. No documented history of violence. No official record of mental health concerns. Just a man quietly drifting into despair, disconnected from family and increasingly detached from the structure of daily life. When looking back, some legal scholars and journalists who studied the case would later ask, was this a man predisposed to violence, or someone who broke under pressure at a specific point in time? The answer may never be fully clear. But what is certain is this. The Richard Jordan who stepped into the events of 1976 was not someone society had flagged, monitored, or feared. In fact, the tragedy that would change everything seemed to come out of nowhere. And perhaps that's part of what made the case so difficult to process, not just for the courts, but for the public. Because when a man with no known history of harm is suddenly at the center of a fatal incident, the shock is deeper. The question's louder. Could it have been prevented? Was it a moment of desperation, or was there something more calculated beneath the surface? These questions would follow Jordan throughout his decades of legal battles. But in the beginning, before the courtrooms, the headlines, and the long years behind bars, he was just another name, another face, another person trying to stay afloat in a world that was quietly letting him sink. And then, in 1976, everything changed. August 1986, Gulfport, Mississippi. It was supposed to be an ordinary day for Edwina Marta, the wife of Gulfport businessman Charles "Charlie" Marta. She said goodbye to her husband that morning, expecting him to return home that evening as he always did. But that evening never came. Charles didn't answer his phone, he didn't show up for dinner. And by midnight, Edwina was calling friends, colleagues, anyone who might know where he was. The next morning, law enforcement became involved. Charles had failed to appear at work or make any contact. His car was missing. And at the Marta family home, something was waiting in the mailbox, a letter. The letter claimed that Charles had been taken, and if the family wanted him returned safely, they would need to deliver a large sum of money discreetly and without involving authorities. At first, investigators treated the case as a possible abduction. The demands were specific, the threat was implied, and the instructions were clear. If the ransom was delivered, the man would come home. The drop-off was arranged. The money was placed in a location outlined in the note. But Charlie never returned. For days, the search continued. Local police, county authorities, even state-level. When officers followed up, what they found led to a devastating conclusion. Charlie Marta was no longer alive. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. From there, it didn't take long for authorities to begin connecting dots. Fingerprints, a vehicle, a paper trail of supplies, and soon a name surfaced, Richard Gerald Jordan. He was arrested within days. When questioned, Jordan didn't resist. In fact, records indicate he spoke calmly with investigators. He provided details, some of which matched facts not made public. He acknowledged that he had acted alone, and that he never intended for the situation to escalate as it had. He reportedly told investigators that financial pressure and desperation drove his decisions, and that he had no prior connection to the victim or his family. Court documents later revealed that Jordan had devised a plan to obtain ransom money. But what began as a scheme quickly spiraled into something far more serious. Whether premeditated or not, the result was irreversible. The courtroom was somber as prosecutors laid out their case. They presented the sequence of events, the timeline, and the decisions that led to the loss of life. Jordan's defense did not deny his involvement. Instead, they argued that his actions were driven by mental and emotional collapse, not calculated malice. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. Jordan was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. At the time, no one could have predicted that this sentence would take nearly 50 years to carry out. The public reaction was swift but not especially emotional. Jordan was not a household name. The story faded from headlines almost as quickly as it had appeared. But behind the scenes, a legal journey had just begun, one that would stretch across generations of lawyers, judges, and prison staff. What happened in Gulfport changed two families forever. One lost a husband, a father, a respected figure in the community. The other would watch a loved one disappear into the system, destined to live out most of his life in a space where time feels like it stands still. But the case itself, it became a study in delay, in justice, and in how complicated both can be when measured in decades. When Richard Gerald Jordan was sentenced to death in 1976, no one expected that he would remain in prison for nearly half a century before that sentence was carried out. But that's exactly what happened. His case became one of the longest-running capital punishment cases in American history, not because of any single legal twist, but because of a series of complex events, court decisions, reversals, and constitutional questions that piled up over time. Shortly after his original conviction, Jordan filed a series of appeals, a standard process in death penalty cases. However, in 1982, something rare happened. The courts overturned his sentence. It wasn't because he had been found innocent, but because they ruled that the jury had not been properly instructed on sentencing options. He was given a new sentencing hearing. In 1983, that hearing resulted in a second death sentence. But again, the case didn't end there. Jordan appealed once more, and over the next several years, his legal team raised additional concerns. Not For a brief time, it seemed like the case was settled. But then, a new issue emerged. Mississippi law at the time did not allow life without parole unless the jury had specifically chosen it. Because Jordan's sentence came from a deal, not a jury, it was ruled invalid. The courts reinstated his death sentence. This legal technicality brought Jordan back to death row not because of new evidence, but because of how the sentence had been handled under state law. From there, the appeals continued. Jordan's legal team cited everything from procedural missteps to evolving standards around long-term incarceration. They argued that keeping a person on death row for decades before executing them raised serious ethical and constitutional questions. Scholars and legal observers began to take note. Was this justice delayed or justice denied? Some pointed to Jordan's clean disciplinary record in prison. Others noted his age and declining health. And a few asked the bigger question: does a death sentence still carry the same meaning when it's delayed for almost 50 years? Mississippi prosecutors maintained that Jordan had received every legal protection available, and that the delays were largely due to his own appeals. They emphasized that the family of the victim had waited long enough for closure, but the legal system had clearly struggled with the case. In total, Jordan's sentence was reversed 3 times and reinstated 3 times. He was sentenced to death in 1976, again in 1983, and once more in 1998. By the time 2024 arrived, the legal process had spanned multiple governors, attorneys general, and court compositions. The case became a quiet symbol not of legal drama but of bureaucratic inertia. Jordan's story didn't dominate headlines. It wasn't part of national protests or media campaigns. It simply waited. And that wait became part of the punishment. As one legal analyst put it, when someone spends nearly 5 decades waiting for an execution, the line between justice and endurance becomes hard to define. In the end, the delay wasn't due to a single mistake or a dramatic twist. It was the result of a system designed to be careful, but often painfully slow. And while the courts may have finally reached a conclusion, the public is still asking, should a punishment be measured only by its sentence, or by the time it takes to carry it out? March 28, 2024, 6:00 a.m. at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman, the early morning air was still. The silence was heavy, not just with routine but with finality. After 49 years of waiting, the time had come. Richard Gerald Jordan, now 78 years old, had been on death row longer than most inmates had even been alive. Over the decades, the world outside had changed in ways he could only imagine. Inside, time had moved slower until this day. According to prison officials, the final 24 hours of Jordan's life were quiet and uneventful. He did not request a large final meal. He did not make dramatic last words. He did, however, spend time in reflection, writing a letter, speaking briefly with chaplains, and receiving a visit from one of the few friends who remained in contact over the years. There was no media frenzy, no national protest, no celebrity tweets or urgent campaigns. This moment arrived quietly, much like the man. Staff described Jordan as calm. He reportedly showed no signs of panic or anger. One official later remarked, "He had accepted it, that's what struck us. He wasn't agitated, he seemed ready." For many who followed the case, this moment felt almost surreal. How does someone prepare for something that has loomed over them for 49 years? Jordan had been transferred to the holding area the night before. He was given time to pray, to write, and to sit with his thoughts. Those who interacted with him said he remained respectful, soft-spoken, and composed. In a final statement released shortly before the sentence was carried out, Jordan did not offer excuses. He acknowledged the pain his actions had caused and expressed a desire for peace not just for himself but for the family of Charles Marta. There were no grand declarations, no attempts to rewrite the past, only quiet. In a time when so many death row cases become spectacles, Jordan's final hours were defined by stillness. The man who once occupied headlines had become, in many ways, invisible. But for those closest to the case, the victim's family, the legal teams, and the state, the moment was heavy with meaning. Because this wasn't just the end of a sentence. It was the closing of a legal chapter that had stretched across generations. No matter where one stood on the death penalty, the timing was impossible to ignore. A man sentenced in the 1970s was now gone, in a world entirely different from the one that had judged him. And the question lingered, did time erase urgency or simply deepen the weight of justice? For those who knew Richard Gerald Jordan personally, he wasn't defined solely by what happened in 1976. He was also a man who aged in solitude, reflected deeply, and faced his final day with quiet acceptance. Whether that makes his story more tragic or more resolved, that's for each viewer to decide. When the case of Richard Gerald Jordan finally came to a close in 2024, there were no breaking news banners, no nationwide protests, no courtroom drama. But what it left behind was something quieter and in many ways more profound. For some, Jordan's story is about consequences, about a man who committed a serious crime and ultimately faced the outcome that the justice system delivered. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how long that process took, and what it means when justice is delayed for decades. His time on death row, spanning 49 years, made his case one of the longest in U.S. history. And that alone raised difficult questions. Is it justice when it takes a lifetime to carry out? What does prolonged isolation do to a person and to the purpose of the sentence itself? Can a system that moves this slowly? Some argued that his extensive appeals showed the system working, that every legal right had been honored. Others believed it revealed how capital punishment, in its current form, can become a test of endurance, not principle. His case has already been taught in some law schools as a complex example of due process over time. Not because of disputed facts, but because of how a clear-cut case can still stretch across nearly 5 decades without closure. For the family of Charles Marta, the loss remains. Nothing, not the sentence, not the time passed, not the final outcome, could bring back the man they lost. For them, Jordan's name may always be a reminder of grief and unanswered what-ifs. But others, including some corrections officials, legal advocates, and ordinary citizens, began to see Jordan less as a headline and more as a symbol of how the justice system can forget, how it can allow someone to live in limbo, neither fully punished nor fully pardoned for a lifetime. And in an era where public opinion about the death penalty continues to shift, Jordan's story added weight to a growing discussion. What should justice look like when nearly 50 years pass before a sentence is completed? There were no last-minute appeals from celebrities, no national movement to stop the process, no clemency granted, but there were still conversations. Quiet ones in classrooms, in editorials, and among lawmakers who wondered, if a man has lived 49 years under a sentence, has that not already served a sentence of its own? Jordan didn't leave behind a public letter. He didn't publish a memoir, he didn't become a symbol by choice. But in the end, his story became something more than just another statistic. It became a reminder that justice, even when carried out, doesn't always feel complete. That time doesn't erase the questions. It only changes who asks them. Richard Gerald Jordan is now part of American criminal justice history, not because his case made headlines in its final days, but because it didn't. He spent nearly 5 decades on death row, outliving his original trial attorneys, multiple governors, and 3 different versions of his own sentence. He died at 78, gray-haired, soft-spoken, and mostly forgotten by the world outside. And yet his case leaves behind more questions than answers. Not about the crime, not about the court's decision, but about what it means to wait for justice in a system that is built on time and yet so often runs out of it. Can a sentence delayed for 49? And even within Mississippi, Jordan's case became part of a quieter, growing debate. Should the justice system measure punishment in time or in transformation? Some said his life had become a sentence in itself. That waking up each day for nearly 18,000 days, knowing it could be the last, was its own kind of penalty. Others believed his final day was the only one that counted. We'll never fully know what Jordan thought in his final moments. His statements were short. His actions were quiet. He didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't ask for pity. He simply let the process finish what it had started nearly 50 years earlier. And perhaps in that stillness lies the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes it is swift. But sometimes it is so delayed that it no longer feels like justice at all. So what do we take from this story? A man who committed a serious act paid the ultimate price, but only after a lifetime of waiting. A system that followed the rules but still left people wondering if the rules are enough. And a legacy that forces us to ask, is justice measured by what we do or by how long we wait to do it? Richard Jordan is gone.